Okay, so here's a set of notes that one of the students allowed me to scan in order to use as an educational opportunity. Again, trying to help those students who still don't understand how is it that you take good notes and what is the expectation. No one's notes are perfect, even including mine. When it is always something you can improve when it comes to your notebook and anything that you do, really. But when we're looking at this, it's about as good as I've seen, with some needed improvements here and there. You'll notice that the first day of his notes for this quarter, he writes, the science fair, he wrote the date it was due. He connected one concept here with another concept here. He has the dates. He's made it a point to identify when the notebook was going to be collected. The amount of weeks he has until the collection. That was the very first day of the quarter. You'll notice that the notebooks, that some of which are still yet to be turned in, you were told that on January 19th the notebook was due. And you see here's that first day of the quarters when I told you that we're going to have our daily morning quizzes, a single question for in order to help you get in the mindset that you're here in class to learn. You'll notice that these quizzes, again, were announced on that day. You'll see that then he drew a line separating this kind of general information from the content of the course. He didn't put a title up. He did write some information, some content information, some facts that were stated in class. And again, continue to write some more facts in a bullet point fashion, which is fine. I wish he would have wrote something here suggesting that he thought about what all this means, but he may have done it on the next page. Let's see. So here on the next day's notes, and the next page of his notes, the same day, you'll see that he continues to write some information about the chromosomes, about the number and how they're organized, and he writes down the facts that were listed in class. But what's interesting to me is that on this side of the page, he writes, if every new generation is going to give a chromosome, how does our cell end up with 46 in meiosis? And the answer he wrote here is meiosis is the answer to this question. Now, I remember asking a similar question in class, so I'm not sure if he wrote it from his own mind or if he copied the question down from what I said in class. But the bottom line is that this question here that he wrote down coincides with this content that was given in class during, I'm assuming, a PowerPoint. And he wrote the question that was very thoughtful. Here he wrote this, the summary of the day's events, talking about the science fair, the major quizzes, the fact that there are 23 chromosomes from the mother and 23 from the father, and then mitosis the meiosis is equals mitosis, where you double them and then divide them. In mitosis, rather, you double them and divide them. So, it shows me so far that he is taking notes. He's taking notes at least on the first day. Let's see what happens on the second day. Now here he's discussing cancer. We discussed cancer that day and how DNA gets damaged. And he wrote down some major ideas and points. Here we have some cancers don't form tumors. And so the difference between malignant and benign tumors. And again, it's a very bullet point list with a summary suggesting that he has given some thought to what these bullet points meant and how they're going to be, how they might be tested. So here you see another day's worth of notes, and you'll see that all the diagrams are labeled. He writes fairly concisely, but all the major vocabulary words are there, defined, drawn, and questions asked about them. What is chromatin? What is a chromosome? What's a chromatid? What's a centromere? What's mitosis? And some questions about the idea of chromatin versus chromosome. Now, what's interesting to me is that on one page, he's covered most of the concepts that were tested on the quiz and then again on the test. I've seen some notes where half this content wasn't covered in the entire quarter's notes, and we've gone over some of this material 3 or 4 times by this time in your notes. Here again is some more information about when things are due. I do tell you often when things are due, what's due. I have you list the information. Here's a numbered list I asked you to write down. I'm sad to say that a lot of people don't even have this written down in their planner, let alone their notebook. So things that were due on the 16th and things that were due then the following week, all of this was moved back and moved back. And you've been given extra weeks to get work done. And I still don't have some work done from some people. But you'll notice that the material's written down here. And this young man knows what's due, when it's due. And then he summarized all the things that were to be turned in the following week. That's after the content was written down on the front page. Notes here, his notes on anatomy week, anatomy camp. You'll notice that he discussed all the bullet points, who was talking about it, what's about hypertension and smoking, what it means to have hypertension, what are the implications of someone who smokes, and why heart disease befalls people that smoke more often than the people that don't. All that discussed on one page. Further notes that he took during anatomy camp, some drawings, again the labels. I always look for labels when I see drawings. I can tell right away that I can see the blood flows coming into the right atrium, then out the right ventricle to the lungs, back into the left ventricle, and from the left atrium, then from the left atrium out to the body. And you see the circulation from the lung. It looks like actually there's a small mistake that in the direction of the blood flow, so I'm not sure if he has this drawn this way that he understands the actual blood flow from the heart to the lungs and then from the heart to the body. I do think he understands that the blood flow goes from the heart to the lungs and then back to the heart, but I'm not sure from this drawing where he thinks the blood is going and coming. But what's important here is that he's shown me evidence that he's thinking about how these things work. And his thoughts on paper help me decide this young man needs help in understanding the flow of blood through a heart and to the lung and then out to the system. So just by drawing this, correct or incorrectly, and labeling him, it gives me information about what this person understands or doesn't understand. And that's really what notes are going to help you do. If he goes back and I tell him this isn't quite right, you have to make sure you understand that the blood flows into the right atrium, then into the right ventricle, then to the lung, then from the lung back to the heart, and then from to the left atrium, then to the left ventricle, and then out to the system or to the rest of the body. If I asked him to redraw this in order to show me that he understood, then it would be very easy to do so. But had he not drawn it, had he not labeled it, I have no information about what he knows or doesn't know. Young man summarized anatomy camp, and he wrote it was a CSU. It was about smoking. It damaged the heart to liver, how smoke damages the heart to liver, heart, liver, lungs, and brain. And that was it. There's a bullet pointed note of his summary of what he learned. Maybe that's all he learned. This is kind of a location or logistical information about where it happened and when it happened, and then some more information of what was covered that in his notes, that there were about 6 pages of notes on anatomy camp. So let's move on to the next section. Okay, here was what we covered in the lab, mitosis, and at this point you had been asked to read and to cover. We'd covered a few of the notes, and I sent you a video on it. And then we went over in the lab. You looked at interphase, prophase, metaphase, and anaphase and telophase. And these are the phases of mitosis. He wrote it here. He said, yeah, this is the answer to this question. And right away, he covered the major points on the exam, the different steps in mitosis very clearly and concisely. The cells are stained. He mentioned how things were stained. He mentioned the amount of cells in each phase. Some of a lot of the data was actually in the chart, like as far as how many cells were in this phase versus this and this. I would have liked to have seen some discussion about where he found most of the cells. I would have liked to have seen some discussion about why most of the cells are in interphase, how that makes sense. That wasn't written down here, so I have no real evidence he understands that. I understand that there were questions that were answered in the actual lab data and some of the conclusion material. But when you're going back to study your notes, are you actually going to go back to the lab data to really hit the highlights? That's the whole point here, is to make sure that you're not just, you'll see what people do in your summaries, is people will write down what they did that day. That's fine. It's fine that you write that. What was the lab about? It was about mitosis. That's great. So those are two decent points. But where I might see somewhere where something that would improve the quality of the notes is to write down what was the big idea. The big idea wasn't that you did a lab on mitosis or that you looked under a microscope to figure out how many cells were in each phase. The big idea would have been that you would find most of the cells in interphase, and that made sense because this is where most of the time is spent by a cell. And that these phases are the phases of mitosis itself, and that cytokinesis is not part of those 4 phases. So when you're looking at a kind of a summary, the summary is, what did you learn from this lab? What kinds of discussions happened? Some of the notes that I see are missing here because I remember watching this young man do his lab along with his group. And I wonder where the discussions that were going on between he and his group as far as the debate of which cell is in what phase. What was difficult about it? I know a lot of students had difficulty with identifying which cell was in which phase when looking underneath a microscope, or focusing in on the proper depth of field when they were trying to get a good picture of which phase the cells were in. It really would have been a benefit to his notes to have that discussion, something like, next time I look under the microscope, I need to make sure that I start with the wide field and zoom into the tighter field. A discussion that might discuss, it was difficult to find a slide that showed the cells in their phases clearly, that it was difficult to count, to decide whether was it in anaphase or was it in metaphase? Was it in prophase or was it in interphase? Some of these phases were difficult to identify the difference between. And what difficulties did you have and how did you solve it? So those are all questions I have when I look at this young man's notes that I'm not sure he wrote the answer to. I'm not even sure he's thought about them. I observed him asking those questions and working out those solutions, but will he remember the next time he does a microscope lab some of the things that he did have difficulty in? Well, I'm not sure. So here's some detailed notes on Chapter 5-1. This was his reading. He not only wrote down the information, the way a lot of students do, some of the big ideas that he found in the chapter. It was well done. He asked questions about it. He asked here, how did you develop from a single cell into an organism with 1 trillion cells? So whether that, cell division, how did that answer his question? Did that answer his question? At least it shows me he's been thinking about it. He thought about this question when it came to cell division. They defined cell division. He defined prokaryotes versus eukaryotes. He defined binary fission, DNA replication, chromosome segregation, separation. So each of the steps that we talked about in binary fission versus mitosis, he has it written down. So when he went to the quiz, where the quiz asked you what's the difference between binary fission and mitosis, over and over again in the multiple choice section, and I think there was a short answer question as well, this young man was ready for that question. Discussion went on about mitosis and cytokinesis, and he clearly wrote down each of the steps. There were 3 pages of notes this day. Scratch that. It looks like there's going to be 4. And so the notes went on interphase, on the synthesis phase, on the growth phase, the control of cell cycle. So this is all about on chapter 5 and all the things that were all covered on the quiz. He's ready for it. He has it bullet pointed. He knows what he has to study. He has questions in the margin. I would have appreciated a little more thoughtful questions on the growth phase 1 versus growth phase 2, some kind of comparison. What's the difference between the two? Some kind of question here that showed me that he was thinking that the synthesis phase came between the 2 growth phases, and what about the checkpoints? Has he discussed or thought about the fact that you have a checkpoint here in the synthesis phase, that there's a checkpoint here in the growth phase in G1, and that these checkpoints, along with the one in mitosis in the M phase, allows the cell to control how many times it goes through cell division. But this was not thought about when he wrote these notes. So again, I would question whether he's thinking about these things as he's reading the textbook. The page of his notes, and it goes on. After a long discussion, mitosis, and a lot of reading and notes in class and on PowerPoints, we went on to meiosis here on January 21st. Okay, and again, if I were to gauge how many pages of notes compared to the content, I mean, 2 chapters in biology and some of the most interesting and probably more important topics in biology. If I were to ask you how many pages, I think we said it'd be about 42 pages. This young man had 90 pages of notes. I'm not asking for 90 pages, but I'm saying this young man took down the notes in class. He took the notes in the chapter. He took the notes on the videos, and he continued again to follow this Cornell note-taking method. Now you'll notice here he has no real questions here, no comments, which again, it begs the question: did he really think about it? Did he go home and process it? I don't know if he processed this information. I do know that he took detailed notes, that he has everything labeled. I know that he's thinking about the vocabulary, because he has all the vocabulary words underlined, and each of the concepts pretty clearly defined. I can see that he knows that we half the number of chromosomes at the end of meiosis for both dad and mom, and then that one of these four come together to form a diploid organism. I know that much from his drawings and his labels, but he doesn't have any content discussion. Any questions, like, does he understand what the processes are here? Does he know everything at this point? Does he know what synapses is? What's a tetrad? I could tell by the drawing that he understands at least the concept, but does he understand what crossing over is? Obviously, these are the things I drew on the board, but I don't have any of his ideas or his thoughts here. So there's all these questions in my mind about what his real understanding is and what's his thinking process. Here, however, it's clear to me that he's thinking about what are the reasons for mitosis, what are the reasons for meiosis. So he's has the answer to the questions here. He wrote the question here. And actually, one of the questions on the test was to compare the reasons for mitosis to the reasons for meiosis. So it was good that he did this. You'll see this over and over again as you go through these notes. All the key parts are well organized and questions asked. Does he rewrite the notes? I don't know. You'll have to ask him. But it seems that he's very, very methodical with the information that he puts in the notebook. He's very thoughtful in many different ways. He makes sure that each of the important keywords are underlined, not just some random highlighted colored words that he puts in there for show, but he just makes sure that it's clear to me that he understands the genetic diversity, independent assortment, and crossing over 3 main ideas. And guess what? All 3 were tested on the exam. I don't think it was a leap. I think it was quite clearly very, very thoughtful process, a result of a thoughtful process. Again, there's some clear descriptions of what's going on. Still, as we move around, we see less and less questions, and I don't know if does that mean that he understands this stuff, or does that mean no matter even if you understand this, what about some ideas about how you might apply this, or some ideas of what this might have a connection to? So again, just proof that he's thinking about it, not just writing it down from what I put on the board. Here again, he's doing some of the thinking. He's writing down no interphase is one of the key points in my meiosis. At meiosis 2, there is no interphase. No, what I wish he would have put was no division of the DNA, no replication of the DNA. The haploid equals n. And n is a number of unique chromosomes. So it's really nice to see that he's put some effort into thinking about some of these concepts and how he might apply them, or how some definitions in this case, or how what's important about this phase, or that humans have 23 unique chromosomes and they come in pairs. That's really a key idea that even extends now into the genetics, into chapter 6. So this was a very important idea, and he wrote it down. You notice his summary is much more thoughtful than some of the others I pointed out. He not only writes down meiosis is in 2 parts. You notice he has each bullet pointed. Genetic variation, independent assortment, and crossing over, which we mentioned on the previous page. He wrote it down again because it was that important to him. And again, all 3 were well tested in chapter 5's exam, and then again even in chapter 6. So it's important ideas are important, and it's always a sign of someone who's paying attention, is able to identify the important material and write it down, and then especially drives home the point that they do understand what the important ideas are, because they've written again in the summary what are the important ideas. Now let's say you don't know what the important ideas are, then that's a cause to have a discussion with me during lunch or after school, or even in an email, where I might be able to explain what the important ideas were for that particular day. If you leave a classroom and you don't know what that class was about, then you need to start putting some effort in to try to figure out what was the important idea for that day. Here we have one of the later notes. He's missing a date up here, but he does have his header. He has plant A and plant B. You know, one thing I notice often, he doesn't put the title for that day's notes, so that again would help me understand that he understood the main idea for that day's notes. He has the plant A, plant B. I'm not sure what day it was, but he has tall. He has P color, maybe? Is that P? I can't read that word. P shape and P color, so that must be some other characteristic of the P. But in any case, he does the Punnett squares. I don't understand if he understands what he means by this question mark and why it's important that he writes it down. If I'm looking at this correctly, it seems like this is his scratch notes for the lab that we did in class, where he sat down and said, well, we know it's tall, but do we know, how do we find out what the second allele is? And that question is answered using a test cross, right? So if you know, you cross it with a small t, if you have any small t's, any short plants, then you're sure that there's going to be that this second t is a small t. So in this case, the question mark is a big T. Now I know that because I described it in class, but I wonder, does he didn't even write the word test cross in here. If I were him, I would have written the word, test cross. And, that's just, I wonder if I can. I would have written the word test cross here. And hopefully I can draw it a little. So writing the word test cross, it would identify what exactly is going on. And there's no definition of what test cross is, right? So the idea that a test cross... So again here, the idea is I would have liked to have seen a definition like the test cross is the crossing of an unknown with a homozygous recessive, just like you see here, homozygous recessive, homozygous recessive, homozygous recessive, homozygous recessive, and homozygous recessive. That crossing with a homozygous recessive will eventually let you know whether this second allele is recessive or dominant, because if it were dominant, they would all show up as the dominant phenotype. He actually got this one here, this cross here, this square is wrong. It should be big T, little t. It should be, well, depending on what it is. If you got big T here, then this would have to be big T, right? If you're getting big G's here, this would have to be a big G. If there's even one little s, then this would have to be a little s, but they're all big S, little s, and this second would be a big S. And if you're getting all big G, little g's, then this would have to be a big G. And if they're all big I, little, if they're all here, all big I, little I, then this would have to be little I, which is where he should have, this would have to be a big I, not a little I, which is where he got this. So he wasn't wrong, excuse me, but he actually had the right answer for each of these during the test cross, which meant that because all the progeny had the dominant phenotype, then you, assuming you had enough crosses, you had 100 some odd crosses here, and here you'll see that there's 100 crosses. And this is exactly from plant A and B from the MIT genetics cross lab, from Mendelian lab. You'll notice that each of these are all dominant in genotype, because you know that because all the phenotypes were all dominant. This is what the test cross is all about, but he doesn't have it defined. The results weren't clear. The reasons, the conclusion or the analysis of the results weren't there. So he had the results written down, but there's no analysis. That's a problem, because he goes back to study it next year to try to figure out what this is all about, and he's going to have a lot more questions than he has answers from these notes. So this is, again, what I keep trying to tell you guys is when you're writing, you're taking notes, you have to think not just about what you're writing that day, but then how are you processing? Where's the meaning? Where's the meaning of the notes? I'm not sure that in 2 or 3 months that this young man could come back based on these notes, that without my annotations could come back and really understand what he wrote here. He may be able to. His mind may work that way. But I have no proof of that. And my job is to assess your ability to be able to do that. Okay, here he wrote, you'll see some of the results or the summaries of a second crossing, but still any real connections being made and no explanations. Now here's a discussion on incomplete dominance and codominance that we had in class, and the examples written up. There's some ideas he's writing down. Main idea here for this particular example, and he sees phenotype red, white, and pink, and that when you're doing this this kind of incomplete dominance, you usually have a third phenotype given only 2 genes. And then we have codominance, the example of ABO blood group. But there's not a lot of details here, and there's missing explanations, keywords, and questions, and no summary at all. So, if you just spent 15 minutes a day, 15 minutes a day is the only homework, is the majority of the homework that I give you. I understand that this quarter we've been dealing with a science fair project. At least most of you, although some of you haven't, I don't think have worked too hard on your science fair projects. But your science fair projects, a lot of you have been putting a lot of effort into them. I understand that. And I understand you have other classes. But all I'm asking for is 15 minutes a day. And if you're not able to give that, then I have a question, how are you managing your time? So this young man did a good notebook. Obviously took a lot of notes. 90 pages minus 4, 5, or 6. They were blank. Still 80 plus pages of notes is a lot. Even looking at today, he didn't have a chance to process the notes, but we talked a lot more. We talked about a lot more than just these 3 things. So writing down the important ideas, I believe that this young man was in my 5th group, so he actually spent most of his day taking notes out of the book. However, for most of the groups, when we're talking about notes, there's a lot of content that you really need to process. Not just write down the information you get from class, but then think about what it means and write the material, write it down. I don't know if you understand it unless you're writing it down. I need to see proof of it. And that's bottom line what the notebook's about. It is about you practicing your questioning skills. It is about you practicing how do you identify the main ideas. It is about you practicing to take notes and clearly organize your ideas and thoughts. It is about you practicing to summarize large bits of information and make connections between major concepts. But I can't help you do that unless I see you doing it, unless I see your thoughts. I can't judge whether your thinking is logical or needs help or needs some fine-tuning. I can't tell if you're making connections or not. If I don't see it, if I don't have evidence of it, then I have to make the decision that you're not making connections. So that's why the notebook is so important, for all those reasons. You need to make, if you're not writing it down, then it's not a thought. It's not a thought you're going to remember in 3 months, in a year. It's not a thought that gets shared with other people. It's not a thought that you can't tell me that you understand if you can't write it down. All right? So I need to see this stuff. That's the bottom line when it comes to this notebook. I hope these notes help. They're very good. I would say he has an A on the notebook. If you want to judge what kind of A, B, or C. He is missing some notes. He is missing some summaries. He's missing some questions, so it's not 100% A, but there's a lot of stuff here that is really good. There's just a lot of stuff that he still is developing, and that's the truth with all of us. So you need to see at least this much if you want an A. All right. Have a good one.